Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see that people are joining. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let everyone who's signed up for the event join the Zoom, and then we'll get started with Jimmy and Mason. Thank you. Okay, I might just start my introduction to the event because it's the least important part, and so if people miss a little bit of that, that's okay. So welcome everyone to this In Conversation event with Jimmy Robert and Mason Leaver-Yap. Thank you very much for taking time out of your afternoon to listen in on the conversation. My name's Dominic Paterson. I'm the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Hunterian, University of Glasgow. And it's been a great pleasure and a privilege to work with Jimmy on his exhibition Tobacco Flower, which opened last week as part of the Glasgow International Festival of Visual Art and continues to the 5th of September. The event today is part of the public programme for that exhibition, and it's co-presented with the Goethe Institute Glasgow. We're very grateful to the team there for their partnership and support. And we owe thanks also to Art Fund, to Glasgow International, and to Timorous Beasties for their support of various elements of the exhibition. And personal thanks to my Hunterian colleague Rachel Hughes for organising this event itself. So today's conversation will last for about an hour. We're going to invite you as the audience to join in or participate if you want, using the Q&A feature to add questions that Mason and Jimmy will try to get round to towards the end of the event. We might not be able to cover all of them, but we'll look out for particularly significant issues or points that you want to raise and try and address them. And Jimmy suggests that they might follow up also any that we don't cover that feel particularly important. Today's event is being recorded, and we anticipate that we'll be putting it online, and there'll be an opportunity then to get around to some of these additional questions. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce our two speakers. Jimmy Robert is a Berlin-based artist whose work encompasses film, photography, text, installation, and performance. Jimmy has exhibited around the world. A multi-venue retrospective of his work is currently on show at Museon in Bolzano, having been shown in a different configuration at Nottingham Contemporary last year. And over the past few years, Jimmy's work, especially in performance, has been a notable inclusion in events like Performance 17 with the brilliant project Imitation of Lives at Philip Johnson's Glass House, Old Masters 2 years ago now, as part of the Frieze Week events in London in collaboration with the David Roberts Art Foundation, and completely unforgettably for me, at Kunstwerke Institute for Contemporary Art Berlin, the performance Joy Noir in 2019, which was commissioned and curated by our other speaker today, Mason Leaver-Yap. Mason works with artists, including Jimmy, to produce texts, exhibitions, and events. Based in Glasgow and Berlin, Mason is associate curator at KW, and they have a long-standing relationship to Jimmy's practice. This piece was commissioned as part of a series of events that responded to the legacy of Ian White, a friend and close collaborator of both Mason and Jimmy's. And I'm really delighted that with Mason's knowledge of the practice and also of the themes that are addressed in it, they agreed to take part in this conversation. Thank you, Mason, and thank you, Jimmy. I'm going to hand over to you. I've got some images of Tobacco Flower that we can navigate around for people who haven't had a chance to see the show yet, and I'll try to do my best to stay in sync with the conversation. Thank you both, and I look forward to speaking to you again at the end.
Thank you so much, Dominic. This is it's a lovely invitation to come to this work and also to experience, Jimmy, your work as a visitor to one of your exhibitions in the city in which I live, which is definitely a first for me. I had the chance to see Tobacco Flower earlier this week, and I feel like it's such a sophisticated handling of material that I think could feel overwhelming, but there is I would say, a kind of really careful choreography in this show that I hope that maybe this talk can unpack a little bit, as a kind of set of movements, of gestures, a kind of process of thinking. And this kind of handling to me is typical, I think, so much of your performance work as it is your kind of object-based practice. And maybe we can kind of talk about those two media in parallel. And it really felt like also a culmination of a lot of things that I know you've been kind of preoccupied with and researching for many years now around issues of aesthetic influence, how these things permeate cultures and follow various circuits of exchange, both on kind of global and intimate levels. And particularly with Tobacco Flower to do with issues of enforced or chosen routes. And you and I have had the pleasure of working together in various different situations over the years. And when I went to the Hunterian and I looked at this photo series that you produced, Creole Earring 1 and 2, I was suddenly remembered the very first time we worked together, which was when yourself and Ian White were performing at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. I think it was 2009. And I was dutifully writing up your program notes, and there was this wonderful phrase, this quotation that you had from the American poet Frank O'Hara, which has kind of stuck in my mind ever since. And I suddenly remembered when I was like looking at this image that's on screen for everyone right now, which was it was a line from one of his poems, and he says, "To be alert is to be decorative," and this has always like kind of haunted me ever since 2009, as something that's kind of quite jarring, is compromised. Maybe it's not even correct in certain ways, but it feels like a kind of provocation of sorts, and it feels really relevant to your show. And then the second thing that I thought about, which I think is also useful in kind of framing the auspices of this project, was something that you had said much more recently. In fact, the last project that we worked on that Dominic just referred to, which was this performance Joie Noire, where I currently work at KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. And one of the kind of questions that informed that performance was, you had said, you had asked this question, like, what is the nature of a body's visibility? And these two things, I think, kind of alertness and decor and body representation, visibility or invisibility, seem so kind of key to the show, but specifically this kind of opening image that is also the first image that you see in the visitor's brochure too. It's a remarkable photograph, and I wonder if maybe we can kind of start there and kind of talk concretely. It'd be really interesting for me to hear, and maybe for you to kind of share with everybody online a little bit about this image, like kind of what informed it when you made it, and also where it is shot. I think that this is super interesting in the context of this exhibition.
Yeah, to maybe come back to this quote from Frank O'Hara about like alertness and like the fact of being decorative. I think it's a bit of a riddle, and I'm still kind of wondering also what it means, but in a kind of enjoyable, active way, constantly trying to kind of deconstruct it or like play with it. And it feels like a paradox, but then it feels also like something that it could be a motto, you know, and then to kind of carry on this thought as like, what is alert? What is alertness? What does it mean to be decorative? And is it a bad thing? And is it enough or is it not enough? And so it has come back recently in some funny way. So it's nice that you mentioned it again. This image, I mean, everything in this show to me is very, very, I mean, it's always very personal, but more than ever, it feels even more personal because it's bringing elements from the Caribbean, where I was born, and to the surface, and as a kind of elements that I want to kind of bring to the fore as and question and think about very, very openly in a kind of hopefully way that I can share. So this image, I don't remember exactly the progress of things, because we've been working on this show now for a while. It was already meant for last year, and there's been a lot of time for it to kind of expand. And but I guess it comes maybe from this idea of what Creole is, or what Creole can mean, the word. And, it refers at once to a language, which is a language that my mom speaks to me. And I could speak it back also, but with a very French accent, so I feel a bit embarrassed talking, using it. And then people can instantly kind of tell, okay, it's not from here. Oh, it's like kind of. So there is already this kind of conflict in me in terms of like, the use of this dialect, but it's also signifying this earring. And I've always been fascinated by this earring, by its shape, by this, like, I remember like, women in Brixton wearing like various like large size of it. And it felt always like a kind of statement, an aesthetic statement. And I was always fascinated by it. And I wanted to kind of play with this circularity and make it almost like a sculpture. And I was wondering how big, the person who made it in Bucharest, the jewelry designer, I was wondering how far can we go till I can actually not turn my head. And it's like almost something in the way. So it's no longer decorative, but it's kind of an impediment almost, because I can't actually turn my head. It doesn't fit. It can only fit from this side and from this kind of display side that that is shut in now.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and it's also, I mean, I think it's interesting that you kind of talk about like, for me, it's like such a focusing tool as well, I think, and it stands in opposition to the grid behind you. Can you talk a little bit about like this kind of scene in like that you're posing within?
Yeah, so this is the Charles Rennie Mackintosh house that has been completely reconstructed in the Hunterian Art Gallery. And that is just basically coinciding or communicating with the walls of the gallery where the exhibition is taking place. And so it's kind of trying to establish a kind of porosity between the walls of the gallery where I am and the house where the picture was taken. And I was obviously fascinated by the house and this whole, kind of Gesam, this idea of this Gesamtkunst, and thinking after working already in the Philip Johnson glass house, and there's this kind of fascination with this like house as kind of life project, and how like every kind of aesthetic element is kind of embedded in like one's life in a way as a kind of statement. And so for me, it was interesting to kind of intervene in this house at once with the body, but also with something that could be seen like an ornament, something that could be seen as a formal element that is not just the body, but that is also an object that then refers also to these other formalities that are happening in the house.
I think it's super interesting because I see it in opposition to this kind of grid image behind. And when I think about grids, obviously as kind of measuring tools, as kind of geographical like plotting of space, and of course these things are to do with possession and carving up space and just, I guess, kind of figuring out the contours of it. And it just feels that there's just on a formal level there is this kind of contrasting thing. But it's also so interesting to hear you talk about the house as a Gesamtkunstwerk, because on one hand you kind of think about like houses again as kind of property and kind of private spaces that you kind of try to like accent towards your own kind of perfection of taste, like what is you, but then who is allowed in that house? And for me, if I think about this more broadly in the context of the show, that your exhibition is literally on top of this. And so if we kind of think about houses and museums and kind of property and who is allowed in and who is who is excluded from these histories and these representations, I think that this image becomes kind of such a loaded a loaded site. And at the same time, there's this kind of thing that I think is so characteristic of your work, which is it's not about explicitly saying something. It's about, there's this kind of subtle foregrounding of potential conflict or decision making. And for me, it's also about how one chooses to become image. You know, that there's like this kind of very striking profile that you kind of set up as a pose, you know. And if I think about kind of the history of like voguing, of pose, of what it means to become the subject of one's image, you know, who controls that image. I think this is such a kind of foray into all of these questions that really opens up, I think, you as a subject who comes to actually kind of cast a hand through the Hunterian collection. You know, this kind of this gesture or these questions of aesthetics. To go back to the Frank O'Hara around to be alert is to be decorative. These are not just questions of living aesthetically. These are questions of living sensually, like in a body, but also like what that means politically. It's a.
Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Jimmy.
No, I was saying, and even and to me, that's then the paradox within that quote, which I enjoy kind of formulating or playing with, this appearance of a certain lightness into a gesture, and that it could be insignificant and just a pose, but it's like one, which is something I address in one of the video work. It's like one is something a pose and one is something a posture, and what is the difference between the two? And things like it's within language, but you know, I think certain movements can be such statements, and you know, and I feel there's a lightness and a heaviness in them, and then also the same with photography, you know, and this idea of like posing and how something is actually also literally a pose in time, you know, and then it remains as well, you know, so it has this kind of longevity or timelessness or stretch, which is beyond, you know, like the image itself somehow, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, with this second image that's on screen just now, there's this amazing kind of brandishing of the hand as a kind of, again, it's like this hand becoming graphic, but it's remarkable to kind of think about, if I think about your hand in the show, of the selection of these objects, you know, this, for me, thinking about your work, I've always been struck both on a formal level within the exhibitions, but also just informally when you send me pictures of things that you're thinking about. Quite often, you know, they're kind of a photograph of you holding something, and that you are at the edge of this image, but your kind of your hand is literally touching the source material. It's showing, it's kind of indexical, but it's also like a kind of holding of material. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the decision making that you had in the works that you selected, because I feel that your hand is so there's such a kind of subtle movement. There's, you know, not to kind of hammer home this metaphor, but there's no heavy-handedness in the show. I think that there is this thing that you talk about around kind of lightness and shade and this kind of orchestration or choreography of material that appears. There's lots of different time periods of work, both within your own practice, you know, work from 2007, but also, you know, as we're looking at here, these Charles Rennie Mackintosh sketches from the mid 1800s. I'm so kind of curious about like what that was to kind of go into, you know, I guess this house, this collection, this museum, and select these things.
I think first it was exciting, just physically going into the archive and seeing, you know, the vaults and like the mechanism, like the machinery around, you know, like how to move, like this big kind of like whatever they call, like, you know, you have like this kind of stirring kind of will to move these walls of archive and kind of physically face like an amount of like history, and then being able to, because I think the index touch really, like why is the hand appearing, is this idea of touch, and what one allowed, or not to touch something, which is something I'm always fascinated by. Or even as a kid, when you were told like not to touch things, and I haven't lost that desire to touch things, because like for me, touching is knowledge. It's like to be able to touch something, to know it, and as if through kind of blindness in a way, and not kind of being able to really seize the importance or the relevance of something until it is kind of, there is a certain physical or confrontation with it, and that I think is maybe like my way into like maybe art in a sense. And but so yeah, so there is this kind of sense of like, being able to kind of grasp things. I mean, some of elements of the archive I also just went through as a digital kind of archive, and not everything I was able to see first, but I traveled back and was able to see them later on. And Charles Rennie McIntosh's work, I think it was because I had visited the museum and I knew, and I'm kind of fascinated also with like Art Nouveau in general, having lived in Brussels. It's something also that was quite familiar, and this whole notion also of taste, and then interrupting also maybe this notion of taste, of what is this taste, and how and who am I in relation to this taste? Do I have this taste? So questions that are kind of, to me, activated when kind of actively going through the works and kind of wondering, how do I establish this taste for myself? Because as it already been made for me, I might kind of, how am I able to formulate it from my own point of view in a way? And so physically handling the material is a way of like kind of appropriating them, holding them and making them physical in my world, and then kind of trying to kind of like, appropriate them literally. And I wanted to also go back to that notion of the grid you mentioned before, because that's something that is also coming back in the show through this fabric, the madras and tartan. And there we see the Jamaican tartan, and I think there might be a close-up of the madras from Guadeloupe. If not, it's basically also a green grid, that this is the one that I found on a market in Guadeloupe, where I'm from, with my mom. We were actively searching for some madras, so that's the name of this fabric that you're seeing that normally women wear over their heads, or it's a kind of pattern that you find across the Caribbean, the French Caribbean in particular. And I was always kind of wondering, okay, this is called madras, and it looks, if you stretch it on a canvas, it looks like a grid, and how again also to position oneself in relation to this grid. And so formalizing a bit this fabric and thinking of it as like in relation to modern art, and then stretching also, and also in relation to tartan. And I know they're not necessarily kind of related, but there is a kind of trajectory which I found is interesting, and that's maybe the same strategy that I have maybe with art, like trying to find these trajectories, various trajectories, as a way of also maybe finding a path through to kind of have a kind of understanding of it, understanding of art generally, and my own practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we kind of think about these kind of grid spaces, of course, like I think about kind of maps and geography, but I also am super aware of, this is a very similar pattern to the design that my Malaysian father wears as a sarong, okay. and Malaysia also being a kind of colonial subject, and also if I think about like imperial subjects, like historically how these things are kind of legacies of that. I mean, this image though, I mean, I guess there's kind of something, sadly Zoom doesn't have scent as a function, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you added to the fabric, because did you also add a fragrance, or?
Yeah, so I did the fragrance to the Jamaican tartan, and I was like, because I think, this show to me is kind of also working on various sensory levels. And so we talked about touch but there is obviously sound. And then I was thinking, okay, this all this floral, all this like density of like the Caribbean could not, and tobacco and smoking, it would be kind of not doing justice to these notions, not to have at least a smell within the show. So I had been kind of searching into perfumes that had, you know, elements of tobacco in them, and kind of there was a like kind of short list of 2 or 3, and it was really that kind of Tom Ford, Gentleman's Club, smell of opulence, you know, also a bit like it's a bit again back to Paris is Burning, you know, like, and it's like opulence, you know, it's the sign of opulence, and very often the sign of opulence goes through expensive perfume, you know, and this kind of notion of something being rare and precious, and how to like also justify, you know, the price of such a thing, and whilst it's completely artificial. And so like very often, you know, there's hardly anything kind of organic in it. It's a completely chemical kind of reaction, and it's chemistry really. But then to add to this kind of layering of like interpretation, I think that thinking of smell as a kind of intervention into the space, and modifying a bit your perception of like, you know, what you're looking at, because there is a smell of it on it, is to me interesting also. And if this smell also then brings about memory in this kind of Proustian way of like, you know, oh, this reminds me of, you know, it's to me even more interesting, because to trigger this kind of not only the visual senses in terms of, do I recognize this fabric, have I seen it before, and how the same experience I've had in a way, trying to kind of trace and put the pieces back a bit like in a puzzle, in terms of, you know, what if I add this to this, what is this creating, in terms of what is this triggering as a memory or as a kind of reference, whether it's art, whether it's personal.
But there's also such a kind of playful relationship with value, like I think in this kind of idea of tobacco, like you talk about like Tom Ford, like being kind of like a smell that is redolent of a country club or a members only Soho, you know, this idea of like the cigar, as opposed to like, you know, like a Berlin club where everyone's smoking all night. This other type of smoke, you know, that there are these values of kind of elite exchange, and then these values of social exchange, which kind of exist outside of that are much more kind of convivial. You know, the image that Dominic's put on screen right now is a still, I guess, and it's an image that you chose to present in negative, of this beautiful Super 8 film that you shot of your mother smoking a Davidoff cigar, I think, and it's even the title of this work, is it called A Davidoff Cigar at Casa del Campo? So it becomes, you know, this particular image is so kind of loaded with all these different layers. On the one hand, you have the title, which refers to the object, a kind of Magritte-like object, and not your mother necessarily, like it refers to the object and not the subject. And then formally, you have this kind of reference, I think, again, that kind of threads through your exhibition in various ways to kind of Whistler and Whistler's mother. Can you say a little bit about how this film came about? Because it feels very particular.
Yeah, I think I was doing a residency there, which was a residency organized mostly for Caribbean artists as a way to meet, and then also as a way to travel to other places. And it was, I mean, it was a little bit fraught with a certain kind of inner conflict, the idea of going to this residency at first, but then also it was the only kind of residency of this kind that was organized. So it was like, okay, there's nobody else doing anything about the Caribbean, and there is now an opportunity. So let's also, you know, check it out and see, and you know what it is. And so I initially did a performance project with my students then. I brought them there and I did an exchange because there was also an art school there. And the students from the art school there came to Berlin and they did a performance together. But I filmed and I produced things while I was there, which I was not sure what I would do with them until the right time came. So my mom came to visit because the Dominican Republic is not so far. So I got her a ticket to come over and, you know, we could hang out, and that was great. And And then at some point I asked her, would you mind like smoking a cigar? And I would just make this quick film. And we've done some films before in the past. So we have this history of working together already. And yeah, and I don't know, there was this kind of, there was this image of like this, embedded in this idea of power, just within within this object, which I wanted to kind of have her kind of play in a sense, because it felt like, okay, like how to kind of play back this kind of idea of doing this residency in a way, and then how try to illustrate the kind of conflict that I may have had with it at the time. And then it doesn't mean that kind of this resolved it, but at least I felt there was a kind of shift within like a humorous maybe also shift in there, kind of asking my mom to smoke this cigar, and in the way that, you know, in some of I'm trying to remember his name on the blank, but there is this documentary filmmaker who kind of showed or kind of revealed how like women smoking cigarette was like a construct in terms of power, you know, and by smoking the cigarette then you obtain the power because you have the phallic kind of symbolism, and so it was kind of in this play, and then also thinking about how Davidoff had made, you know, the cigars first in Cuba, and then they moved, you know, to the Dominican Republic. All this kind of very shifts, you know, the revolution, communism, and but not try to kind of deal with everything at once, and just have again a gesture, a simple gesture that would be kind of almost a kind of flippant one, also, you know, that would kind of be alluding to all of this, because my mom doesn't really smoke cigars. She smokes cigarettes a lot, but she doesn't really like cigars. And so, and I think there was a kind of tacit understanding of like what this meant as a little kind of intervention of our being there, and us kind of playing along with it within this space as well, which was a very, very, very unusual space. I mean, it's a village that is totally been a 16th century Spanish village that's been completely reconstructed. And so, yeah, so there is also this idea of like, we're almost in a film set kind of, and the residency was set in this film set, and which is again in another gated community. So there was all these layers just being there also as an artist that were kind of going to my head. And then of course Haiti, and so it was really super interesting on many levels. And I think I still have material that I still haven't, you know, done anything with, and I would like to work with, that eventually will take form.
I mean, it's so interesting to think about like all these kind of constructions, or like these, as you say, kind of layers of artificiality, and yet the kind of the net result, or the formal net result of the video that you produce is kind of like particularly with when you see it, when it switches to like negative, when you kind of see this image that you would normally see in a particular way, but is it inverted and therefore sort of refreshed and psychedelic, is like a kind of formal echo of this Creole earring portrait that you have of yourself, and again in this kind of artificial backdrop, these kind of interventions. But in this instance, it feels like your mum is giving you this gift, you know, which is this, I don't like cigars. And also I really like this detail that she doesn't like it and that she's doing it anyway, to kind of, you know, flip the bird at kind of ideas of, you know, if I think about Arnold Schwarzenegger with a cigar, or something kind of, you know, kind of a stereotype of kind of a revolutionary image of masculinity, like Fidel Castro with a cigar, this kind of Cuban thing. You know, it's really interesting to think about like the shifts, or like these small gestures that are, you kind of, I feel like there's always like this pushing back, this kind of, this, I feel like your work is never like a no, it's like a, well, maybe like ... And this kind of work feels very much like that. And it leads very nicely into this, the second piece that you did with your mother, this sound work that's in the stairwell of the Hunterian, where she, again, it's this gesture of doing something that perhaps, you know, women don't do, which is to like play these drums. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think your description of it is really,
Sure.
is really great.
So I think basically I offered my mom this drum at some point because she manifested like the interest for it, and I was like, yeah, you should totally do it. You should play drums. It's great that you want to do this, and I think that's a way of us to kind of to get closer to each other, and so for her to understand a bit more what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry. And I really wanted her to see the show, and I think to a certain extent she gets it. And so I offered her this drum, and it turned out I found out that there's really very few women playing drums in this way, and then so I really kind of wanted to encourage her to do that, and she does it still, and I'm very, very happy that she does. And I found this book actually on her shelf, and this poetry book, and then I just kind of basically stole it and asked. I wanted to kind of check out like what was in it, and I read some of the poems. Some of them I found a little bit problematic, but what I found out was that the book was also dedicated to her. And I was like, okay, so who is this person dedicating you a book? And so, but like back in the 90s already. So we had this conversation, and then I isolated one text. And then I thought, well, it'd be very interesting since this book was dedicated to you, then how about also pushing this further in terms of reading one of them? And since it's in Creole and she speaks better Creole than I do, it would make more sense that she reads it in a way. And I chose a particular text that to me also was dealing with womanhood and addressing issues of strength and power, and also because I think it's like, I mean, you know, at the end also I'm not putting myself in terms of I've partially grown up in the Caribbean, and I think, you know, this, from what I remember, and however much she says it has changed, I remember it as quite, you know, sexy, homophobic, misogynist. And so for me, there were all these things that I wanted to also kind of deal with within this exhibition. And so like within that poem, I think there is like all of this. And that's how it kind of got a little bit emotional just now. But and it was like, okay, like I don't know also why, but it felt like this was, in terms of time, all of these things came together at the right time, and it kind of made sense that she would be reading this and then using this drum, and then, you know, as a kind of also mantra of kind of, you know, getting this confidence, and this is possible, and we can do this, and we can work together in this project, and so bringing a voice in it also, and so, and actively, and I think she really enjoyed doing it.
and the poem is this kind of, is it like a kind of, it, I mean, it sounds, without knowing too much about the backstory of it, you provided the translation in the stairwell, so I kind of listened to your mother performing this piece with the drum, and then read the translation along, and the poem, it's like a kind of, it's like a lyrical kind of ode to like I guess the strength of women, but specifically women who kind of pushed back against the idea of themselves as colonial subjects, and also pushed back against the, like, their enslavement, and you know, it has this kind of power that runs through it. And it's so interesting to me that this is the thing that you hear this before you see the show, you know. Your mother is kind of this figure, like she figures in the in your exhibition as image, but in some ways she kind of as a guardian, I guess, or like that was my experience of it, that she's a kind of protector of the show.
Yeah, definitely, or kind of also an introduction into it, or kind of a guide, or a kind of a voice, and a kind of a guide through the show, for reading the show, or through understanding the show, and that will be kind of echoing still while looking at some of the works. And so, I was talking about this notion of things being multi-sensory. So as this, having this sound as a kind of, that guides you through the reading of images. And I guess maybe that comes back to maybe some of the elements in the performance at Cave as well, how, you have like some elements from ballet and some elements from disco, but then how influential the music or the light could be in terms of reading these elements and how they can just suddenly stir any interpretation in a different direction. That was something that I found very interesting. This poem and this poet is, I think, and I read and through my discussion with my mom and my editing of it, because it's not the entire poem, and I removed some section of it that I was not agreeing with. So it is an edited version. It's from somebody I think was part of an independentist movement, and I was also wondering how did she have a conversation with this person at some point, and for it to be dedicated to her, and what kind of conversation. And I guess initially when we talked about the exhibition, or about doing an exhibition in Glasgow, at that point I was also thinking about this notion of independence, and Glasgow talking about independence made me, that's what kind of initially brought these two things together, because I was thinking, oh, okay, what of this discourse around independence in the Caribbean, and what our place is asking for when they talk about independence. And so, voilà.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. It reminded me of this I guess this kind of historian and theorist who Kieran Finlayson, who I think is based in New York right now, and he had this great point that he said, kind of the history of art and the history of freedom must be read through and against one another. And I think that there's a way in which the history of art and the history of freedom are completely imbricated in your show. They inform one another, and it's also the reason why you kind of invoke this history to kind of think about independence in relation to Scotland. It's really hard to also there's a need to talk about Glasgow and the history of Glasgow, not as a colonial subject of England necessarily, but as a kind of absolutely complicit kind of operator in the triangular slave trade, and what this did in terms of the decimation of peoples and culture for kind of socioeconomic gain in Britain. And I think that there's ways in which this kind of idea of even the title of the show, Tobacco Flower, referring not only to the tobacco trade, but also this kind of the floral or the design or the decor aspect, the aesthetics seem to be so kind of key. And it really reminded me of a couple of conversations that I had with a friend and photographer, Ingrid Pollard. We'd been reading Jamaica Kincaid's writings on the garden, and also her book Among the Flowers, and the ways in which Kincaid talked about gardens as a way of possessing aesthetics, or as a way of kind of reading through kind of various forms of control. But also gardens are also about kind of I guess codifying things, like calling things by their Latin names.
Yes. There is also something in there about taste and like knowledge and like you said, ownership in a way, and like how also the idea of the secret garden, also like things being kind of kept away from others and cultivated, and this whole idea also of cultivation and versus culture, kind of think about it etymologically is very interesting. How you cultivate yourself, how you enrich your knowledge or your reference by literally like feeding and growing this garden, or it's like say it metaphorically. And to me, there is definitely something like in relation to this idea of flower, and it's movement, or it's travels, or it's like genealogies, or kind of yeah, movement also, you could say, just simply this movement that I found kind of very interesting. And again, that comes back to this idea of decor, because you would think, oh, it's a simple flower, you know, like this illusion of simplicity or of things being kind of casual, but yet you know, with this heaviness in them. It's something that I found is very interesting.
Yeah, and I think that there's such kind of you kind of strike this kind of poise between these things, like by marrying the kind of the idea of the aesthetics of the flower with, you know, tobacco. Like if we kind of pivot a little bit to kind of you know, this issue of smoke, you know, like of smoking tobacco, you know, smoke I feel is like it's like such a useful vector for thinking about a multiplicity of things, like whether or not that's kind of geography through like a kind of historical geography like imperialism, or a kind of contemporary geography about, like, if we think about health of people, like through kind of industrialization, like you know, the smoke produced by factories, as well as kind of you know, issues of economic, socioeconomic inequality, but like who benefits from the process of smoking. It feels like all of these issues that feel so potentially sprawling get contained, or you kind of point to very precise moments where these things kind of come together, whether or not that is a kind of a tracing of a Charles Rennie Mackintosh flower, or whether it's, you know, your mother sitting smoking the cigar within a residency run by the tobacco company. You know, it's like these enclosures try so hard, I feel like, in a political life to kind of evade explication, or but there's a way in which I feel like this exhibition like really holds these gestures together and says, look, these things can be sequenced, and if you sequence them in this ways, they can be seen. And I think that that's kind of what's so deft about your arrangement, or, like, as I said earlier, like this kind of choreography through the show. I'm conscious of time. I wonder if we should, I don't know, Dominic, if there's questions that
there are some
you want
questions
to kind of bring through. Also, I was going to say to the audience, you know, don't feel you need to wait for to be asked. Definitely, if there are questions for Jimmy, even if we don't answer them now, we can try to answer them later.
There's a question about the Creole, what Creole means, and that it hasn't been answered. Shall I mean, are you there still?
I don't know. It says anonymous attendee. So I guess it's, yeah, I guess there's a kind of question about like what Creole maybe means to you. I think it's interesting to kind of think about this in terms of the fact that you say that you feel informed by it, and yet you speak it in an accent, which is obviously to position yourself a little outside of it, whereas your mother does speak. Like,
yeah, and I think first Creole for me, it means kind of a mixity, a diversity, and so I think it's one of these terms that as soon as you kind of maybe try to pinpoint it, it's kind of escaping, in the sense that it's kind of made of many different things and it's not static. And that's what I like about it, because it's kind of trying to englobe many things. So Creole is at once a language, is at once a hearing, but Creole is made of French elements, but Spanish elements, English elements also. Somebody could be Creole, food can be Creole, so it's an adjective as well. So it's basically representing to a certain extent this idea of the mixity of the Caribbean, and the fact that things have various provenances, and you cannot say, oh, it's one thing or it's another. And that's what I like about it. It's like embracing diversity and it's kind of full complexity. So there are elements in Creole and in the Creole culture that could be coming as far as Asia. And it was interesting that you mentioned, for example, the Malaysian fabric, because there is a hat that we could show you very briefly if you have a minute.
We always like a little bit of show and tell with objects. And I think it's also this thing that's interesting about the way that you describe it, Jimmy, it's about kind of refusing like some kind of pure, oh wow.
Oh, this is the hat that I found on an island, which I think was clearly influenced, by I think a Vietnamese sailor that once passed through Guadeloupe and stayed on some elements on one smaller island in the Caribbean. These hats are then stretched over with the madras. And I was looking at them and I was like, but where do they come from? Like, what's the history of this? And then I went a little bit more into it, and they're coming from Southeast Asia, and they have stayed. So that's what I mean in terms of the language. There are also elements. For example, like a goat is cabrit, and that comes from cabrito in Spanish. And so that's what I find is super fascinating. This like, and also how these forms are traveling and being exported, just like the goods, and with the goods, maybe they have been exported. Yeah. And so this diversity and this impossibility to fix anything is, to me, what makes it also very potent.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great kind of power in that movement, and I think also just to trace it is to kind of think about kind of diasporic influence and like what are the aesthetics of a kind of a diaspora. It seems to be so key, like to your show, but also to these things that we've been talking about. Dominic, I don't know if there's another question that you wanted to.
There's a question from the director of Glasgow International, so I think we're probably in some way legally obliged to answer that one, but thank you, Richard, for the question. I was going to add one thing to the discussion of definitions of Creole, and there's the wall text that run through the show at one point cite the Martinique-born poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant, and Glissant's always really careful to not use Creole as a noun, as a defined term, but to use it to refer to a process. He talks about creolization. And I think that's very much, that idea of these constantly transforming and repermuting forms, that if there's a politics around self-representation in the show, it's also about not being made into a noun, but always this sense of process, which, again, all the things you guys talked about around being decorative and so on, the possibility of an aesthetic transformation that might play off the political, the poetic, and so on is so key. But Richard's question was about how the pandemic and not being able to travel for the install and be present in the show when it was coming together has affected it, and if there were additional works or other ways of working that might have been included otherwise. And I know this is something we've talked about quite a bit, Jimmy, the strange feeling about making a show in the absence of the artist when the touch of the artist is so central. And maybe, I don't know if you would like to speak to that and how it seemed from your position in Berlin.
Yeah, well, it is weird. It still continues to be weird, but I think it's just this sense, it's more this sense of completion of like, well, feeling, okay, this show has happened, in this kind of part sense of like, this has happened, it's photographed and it's framed and placed in the head somehow, but also physically experiencing what it is to walk from one piece to another, and how the sound of my mom playing the drums and the smell in the canvas, what do these experiences create? And I think I will have them to live through other people's experience until I have my own. So that's maybe the only thing, but I think I completely trust that, the team and you as a curator, and you've been very kind of sensitive to approaching all of this. So I also had to let go and, of this and be invisible in the sense, because this whole show is about this kind of sense of trace. So it's also interesting just to live these traces and not be there, because, I'm not normally, you're there for the opening and then you're gone also. So it must have this life, and that's also what is interesting about, doing it.
I think we should probably mention as well that the plan had been to present Joy Noir as a performance in a former tobacco bond, and there would have been a great resonance, I think, between that work and the show. But also, I kind of alluded to at the start, it's a really brilliant piece in its own right. So unfortunately, it looks like the pandemic might have made that impossible, but representing the performance side of your practice was always part of the the concept for the show, and we had various conversations along the way about how that would happen. I think that's something that I've loved in bringing the show together is the in real life aspect of seeing work on the wall and seeing a real audience attend it. And I know that as people get back to being able to see performance work, I think that'll be valued even more in that context too. The sense of the audience's presence with the work and sometimes with the artist is just so invaluable. I feel like we're all going to come back to it very alert and attentive.
Maybe there will be some ways to do it again at some point. Hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only other question that I think we haven't responded to was from Claire Henry, and she was asking where the Davidoff residency was. Do you want to answer that, Jimmy?
Yeah, it was in the Dominican Republic. It's like, I think if you type it online, art residency Davidoff, you might still have some it was in this, yeah, I think there's some articles around it still, because we were like, there was Natasha Dinwala, there was Louis Thomas Anderson, a group of artists, Paul Maheke also, I think, went there. So I think artists who are kind of linked to the Caribbean in various ways, and or curators kind of went there. It didn't last very long, maybe 2 or 3 years, and they were doing it on. And then it was interrupted also quite abruptly. But I think there is also some of the people that were working around it have like kind of arranged like another form of continuing the work that they were doing there, because I think it was really important. So despite the fact that there is not maybe the financial support to do it, they're still kind of working on it with all their hearts and passion. So I think there are some other kind of residencies happening still there. Yeah.
I think we've managed to get to all the questions, and we've had such a rich, thoughtful conversation. Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Jimmy, for spending time kind of in the atmosphere of this exhibition and unfolding it so interestingly. I really appreciated a chance to see it through your eyes, having spent so much time seeing it as in that kind of curatorial perspective. And I love the exhibition. I'm so pleased that you agreed to work with us on this, Jimmy, and thank you also, Mason, for agreeing to talk about it. Hans Georg, the director of Goethe Institute Glasgow, I think would like to just say a few words in conclusion, and then we will let everyone get back to the sunny afternoon in Glasgow, or however it is where you are.
Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you.
Well, dear audience, Jimmy, Mason, Dominic, and Richard, as the director of the Goethe Institute in Glasgow, my team and I, we were very happy to have been able to support this presentation of Jimmy Roberts' work at the Glasgow International Festival. So I would like to thank everyone for participating in this insightful conversation this afternoon we had. And the Goethe Institute is always delighted to be a partner of the Hunterian Art Gallery and Glasgow International. And you probably know it's our mission to facilitate dialogue and exchange between cultural partners in the UK and in Germany. So additionally, the artistic exploration of the traces of post-colonial histories and the relationship between Europe and the Caribbean is one we find really very, very important to support and present. And I was happy to hear more about how the current exhibition fits in with Robert's existing body of work. And in the name of the Goethe Institute, I wish you, Jimmy, all the best of luck in your future endeavors, hoping we meet again in a not too distant future in the real world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Mason. Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, Hanks.